welcome Director of AIPAC AIEF in Israel, Dr. Cameron Brown.
Good afternoon. First, thank you to Marvell for sharing your inspiring story and your passion for our work together. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining today's session. This afternoon, we're going to look inside the U.S.-Israel diplomatic and strategic relationship. And we're going to hear directly from the men and women who help strengthen the ties between our nations. We're also going to have a chance to explore the many challenges and opportunities that come with representing Israel on the world stage. On, in fact, one of the most complicated of the world stages, the United Nations. Our first guest played key roles in the United States' historic decision to move its embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Rabbi Aryeh Lightstone is Senior Advisor to David Friedman, the United States Ambassador to Israel. Joining him is Dr. Jonathan Schachter, who until just a few months ago served as Foreign Policy Advisor and the point man for U.S. policy for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So with us to discuss the embassy and to give us a glimpse of behind the curtain, what it felt like to go through that process, please welcome my two very good friends, Aryeh Lightstone and Jonathan Schachter.
Cameron.
All right. Good to see you. So unquestionably, first of all, thanks for coming.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us. One of the most important developments in the last 2 years, unquestionably, has been the move of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And that being said, first of all, it's important that two people who were actually in the room behind the closed doors throughout the process are here to share their experiences and their thoughts with us. But I'd like to start with Jonathan, actually, and ask you, how do you understand the importance of this move from Israel's perspective? I mean, look, the Prime Minister goes, he meets with the President, he's got a huge agenda, many things he wants to discuss. Why is this a topic? And more importantly, what are the implications? What does it matter that the U.S. has its embassy in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem?
Okay, so thanks again for having us. I'd like to start actually by saying that this is, I think hands down, this is my favorite policy issue of all of my time in the Prime Minister's office. Because we could talk about Iran, and we could talk about the nuclear deal, and we could talk about the Palestinian peace process, and everything's very complicated. And we could talk about it, I have answers, but there's a lot of nuance and history and details. And the answer was straightforward: is should the embassy move to Jerusalem? Yes. Next, and that was it. And in fact, I remember being on a helicopter. We were about to take off with the Prime Minister, and the spokesperson got a message, an inquiry from a journalist. It said, the Trump administration has announced it's going to be moving the embassy. What's the Prime Minister's response? So the spokesperson goes to the Prime Minister and says, we got this question about the Trump folks have said, what's your response? The Prime Minister goes, great! That was it. It's very straightforward. But in terms of the importance, I think the importance is on several levels. There's I think the historical, spiritual level, where you have Jerusalem as the capital of the Jewish people from the time of King David. It's 3,000 years, and it's recognizing a historical fact. There's also called a Zionist piece of it, which is, the Zionist idea was you're going to have a state like every other state, and every other state gets to pick its own capital. But you had this anomaly where Israel is the only state that doesn't get to pick its own capital, and so it rights that wrong, which actually makes things right in the world. But then there's another piece to it, which is has to do with peace. And here, I'd actually approach it from the other angle. So what did not moving the embassy achieve? And when you see President Abbas go to the United Nations and give a speech, he talks about the Islamic connection to Jerusalem, and he talks about the Christian connection to Jerusalem, and he forgot to mention the Jewish connection to Jerusalem.
Oops.
And when you see Palestinian initiatives at UNESCO, right, which talk about Jerusalem and talks about it being an Islamic site and a Christian site, but oops. And so you have this effort to ignore and erase the Jewish connection to the land of Israel in general and to Jerusalem in particular. And not moving the embassy helped keep that fantasy alive. And so the decision to move it actually shattered that fantasy. Said, we are not going to accept this anymore. And as the Prime Minister has said, there's no peace agreement where Jerusalem isn't the capital of Israel. And in that sense, by shattering that fantasy and by making such a strong statement, I think it was actually a positive thing for peace as well. So for all of these different reasons, it's very important and very high on the agenda.
Excellent. Aryeh, question to you. So why do you think that this was President Trump's, one of his first foreign policy decisions? And saying in the ambassador's office, why do you believe that the ambassador thought that time was of the essence, that this should be done now instead of waiting?
So to understand why the president made this a priority, you just have to understand that since 1995, to a great deal of effect and credit to you guys in the room, this has been the law of the United States of America, a bipartisan, strongly supported by over 85% of the United States of America, to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and to move both the embassy and the ambassador's residence to Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And that's been the law since 1995. The better question is why hasn't the administration followed the law since 1995? And there's been a reason. You can sign a waiver. The president had the right to sign a waiver every 6 months to explain that for national security reasons, that America, we cannot recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and we can't move an embassy to the capital of Israel. And that's fair. There was groupthink along that lines, and there was data that backed up that groupthink to a great deal. And when the president signed a waiver in June of 2017, immediately after that, the Senate at 91-0 demanded that the president, in June of 2017, obviously a very cohesive Senate at that point in time, 91-0, declared that Jerusalem should be recognized as the capital of Israel and immediately moved the embassy there. And on December 6th, 2017, the president, with conviction and courage and vision, allowed me as a U.S. diplomat, and far more importantly, my boss, who's the greatest person that I've ever had the privilege of working for, Ambassador David Friedman, stand up and speak to groups and say, I welcome you officially to Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. And if you can imagine that, I mean, it's difficult to imagine sitting in this room. An American diplomat could not say that on December 5th, 2017. And the beautiful thing was, on December 6th, 2017, when the president made that historic announcement, the question was, how quickly are we going to open up an embassy in Jerusalem? And the ambassador was of the mind, as was the administration, that get it done immediately. Because this is a region of the world where it does not matter what you say. It matters what you do. And I keep this coin in my pocket. I actually wanted to share with Jonathan. That says on December 6th, 2017, that the sacred city shall call forth the best of humanity, which is what the president said when he recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel on December 6th. And on May 14th, what Prime Minister Netanyahu said about our president. President Trump, by recognizing history, you have indeed made history. And on this side of the coin, it says, promises kept. Because the president has been crystal clear. It does not matter what you say if you don't follow through with actions. And the ambassador and the president in this administration said, we recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and we are going to build an embassy on May 14th at 4:11 p.m., 70 years to the minute from where Harry Truman recognized Israel as a fledgling state. We corrected a wrong not for the sake of Israel. Don't confuse yourself. We put our embassy in the capital of Israel because it was the right thing to do for America. And so this is for you.
We're going to get to that question of how on earth we went from December to May and actually having an embassy in Jerusalem, and that was very, very quick. We're going to get to that in a second. I want to first stay for a moment at that decision. For 20 years, when presidents have had to sign that waiver, one of the reasons they did it was because they were presented with assessments that said the region will burn, there will be bloodshed. Did the president hear a similar assessment this time?
Yeah, I mean, the president was presented with information, and he did something that people who are new to this experience would do and question, where's the information coming from? Why is that the information? And is the information valid today? And that's a fascinating question. It's a little bit sad that that was perhaps the first time the question was formulated in that way, but the world changes. And if you guys haven't noticed, the world changes incredibly rapidly. And the president said perhaps the information that we have and the groupthink that we've established may have changed over a period of time. And unless I have a valid reason to not follow the law, to have a waiver, to loophole around the law, why don't I want to follow the law? And the question was, what are the obstacles to being able to do this? And there were numerous obstacles, numerous obstacles, amongst them the entire groupthink, if you will, of our government, and not in a negative way. It was just understood that this would potentially cause potential conflict, and it was unclear what the upside was. But the president saw through the potential downside. He saw enormous upside, much less so for Israel, but much more so for the United States of America, and decided that he had the ability, the courage, the conviction, and the vision to say the information he is getting is not perhaps current, and if it's current, perhaps it's not understood in the way that it should be at this very moment in time.
Well, look, predicting the future is always going to be difficult for anyone. Whatever information people present, there's always going to be a question about what's going to happen that no one 100% of the time is going to predict. Jonathan, do you think that maybe one of the reasons why that previous assessment did not hold up in practice was because of changes in the region?
I think it's possible. I think that there's a sense of fatigue with the conflict in the region, which we're seeing. I think not just at the level of leaders, but also to some extent at the level of publics. In terms of the leaders, I can tell you, having traveled around the world with the Prime Minister and being in countless meetings with presidents and prime ministers, what we kept hearing time and time again was Israel has the stuff that we need in order to make our people's lives better, healthier, longer. And we're no longer willing to subordinate the interests of our people to the whims of Abu Mazen or to the conflict that you have with the Palestinians. And I think it's safe to say that the people that we heard that most loud and clear from was from our neighbors in the region who we have conversations with. So I think that could have been part of it. It's not too dissimilar from what we're seeing right now with the announcement last week about the Golan Heights, which has also been met with sort of a shrug.
But in particular, I mean, I think that the increase of the Iranian threat has also changed the way states in the region are looking at Israel. They're looking at it differently, I think, in the past. I want to go back to the second for what we talked about, that if the president made his decision on December 6th, and at the event on May 14th, only 6 months later, you actually had a building that was ready to do that, how on earth does that happen? I understand why you want it to happen, but it took, I think, in London something like a decade for them to have an embassy, a new embassy building.
You know that we opened up our embassy in Jerusalem on the 364th day of David Friedman being the ambassador in Israel? If you have a to-do list on your first year on the ground, that's called making a deadline. I mean, this was beyond impressive, and he did this at the specific and explicit direction of the President of the United States of America. And there's something that's fantastic. When the Commander-in-Chief says, get something done, then the country gets something done. And what's interesting about the way that we got it done was that it wasn't operating our embassy in our country, it was operating our embassy in your country. And you should take tremendous gratification from the fact that we sat in, I don't know, dozens of meetings together. And there was never the word can't, there was never the word won't, and there was never the word impossible. And on occasion, when somebody would sit in the meeting and begin to say no, they would get the raised eyebrows from Jonathan or somebody else on his team. And it immediately turned into a maybe, and slightly after that, we're able to nudge it into a yes. And the reason why that was important to do was it's in a region where you don't have committee meetings and RFIs and RFPs to discuss maybe what the design structure is ultimately going to look like. This is not how it works in any other country in the region. The president made a decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital and to immediately commence moving our embassy to Jerusalem. And the goal is, how quickly can we do it? And the president was presented with numerous different plans. And the ambassador presented him with a plan at a very affordable price to have an embassy open in 5 months. And I was in the car with the ambassador after he had had the conversation with the president. And the ambassador looks at me and says, "What's the downside?" I said, "Well, I live in Ra'anana. I go to Tel Aviv every day. Now I'm going to go Ra'anana to Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, back to Herzliya, back to Ra'anana. It's going to be pretty tough on me." Wrong statement. The ambassador turned to me and says, "The day that you are not proud to drive to your embassy in Jerusalem is the day you should be brushing up on your resume." And he was so incredibly correct. Every day, I put on my little pin. To the best of my knowledge, I'm the only person employed in Israel who has to wear a tie on a daily basis. And I get to go like this and go like this, and I get to go to your embassy in Jerusalem, the capital of Israel.
So over the past few decades, there has been, in fact, several decades, the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem has operated independently of the embassy. That really started, I think, if I recall correctly, in the early 90s, and served as, quote-unquote, the embassy to the Palestinians. And it meant that, ironically, the U.S. diplomatic presence to Ramallah was based in Jerusalem, while the U.S. diplomatic presence to Israel was in Tel Aviv. So we understand why we moved the embassy, but then there was a decision to fold that consulate into the embassy. Why?
So the first thing to know is I thought I was going to come to Israel and learn a tremendous amount about Israel. I've learned far more about the United States of America in my time in Israel than I did about Israel. The career Foreign Service officers that work at the State Department might not agree with everything that the administration does. They might not agree with the ambassador. They are hardworking, dedicated professionals who have done something that I have not done and most of you have not done, which is to dedicate their profession to promoting U.S. interests around the world. And they don't get the credit and they don't get the glory the vast majority of the time, but their professionalism is fantastic. And the challenge is, we opened up a consulate in 1844 in Jerusalem. And since the early 90s, it was the de facto diplomatic mission to the Palestinians. And we looked after we opened up an embassy in Jerusalem, and the question was, what are we doing in Jerusalem with an embassy and a consulate? How do we speak with two voices representing the same country at the same time? Is that the most efficient and effective way to go ahead and to promote U.S. interests in the area? And the answer was most certainly not. So what we did was we merged, for the sake of efficiency, efficacy, and professionalism, both of these departments together. This in no way, shape, or form is a belittlement to the Palestinian people, and no way, shape, or form is a difference to the Israeli people. We all work, whether we worked in Tel Aviv, we worked in Jerusalem in Arnona, or we work in Jerusalem on Agron Street, we represent the greatest country in the history of the world, the United States of America. And we have a privilege. We have a privilege of representing this great country to one of our dearest friends, if not our dearest friend in the world, the State of Israel. And our goal, you should applaud for that. And our goal with a combined mission is not to elevate or denigrate. The goal is to boost U.S. interest in the area by elevating the ability for every individual in that area to succeed and to come close to the United States of America. As Jared Kushner said so incredibly eloquently at the opening of the embassy, the relationship that we have with the U.S. and Israel is the envy of most other, if not every other country in the world. That does not mean that we reduce that relationship so other countries will feel equal. Every other country should be able to strive and achieve that relationship that we have with Israel. It's a fantastic relationship. We're the United States of America. We're the greatest force for good that exists in the world. People should want that relationship that we have with Israel.
Well put. So last question, and to both of you. And Jonathan, you've already touched on this a little bit, but look, we're looking forward to the peace team laying out the peace plan in the coming months. How does the embassy move fit into that? There were a number of statements about this on the final status issue. How is that going to work into the peace plan? Of course, this is an intimate setting, so I'm sure you're going to want to let us know everything in that plan.
The map is backstage. Do you mind?
Exactly.
Okay, no. So, I mean, the president said at the State of the Union a phrase that is so eloquent and so simple and yet so true. Principled realism. Are we going to look at narratives? Are we going to look at ideas and conversations? Or are we going to look at facts? And how do those facts lay out? And the president, with his team, my boss amongst others, have used both of those words combined to reset the reality in the region. And the reality in the region is bringing us so much closer to peace. Because you can't make peace based upon myths. You can't make peace based upon narratives. But you can make peace. You can strengthen our relationships with realism, but not just realism in isolation, realism that is based upon principle. And if we follow those two things, there is no doubt that tomorrow is going to be better than today. And with the leadership of President Trump and this administration, we are headed towards a better tomorrow based upon principled realism.
Gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Aryeh and Jonathan, it was a
Thank
pleasure
you.
to have you both.